The opening of the Gordie Howe International Bridge could be delayed until 2026, despite construction being on track to be completed next month.
The breaking news with that major bridge connecting the U.S. and Canada finally reopened overnight after being shut down for days by protests.
Protests on the U.S.-Canada border. The Ambassador Bridge, which we've been telling you about connecting the U.S. and Canada, finally reopened overnight.
After days of disruption caused by protests, the key border crossing between the U.S. and Canada, the Ambassador Bridge, has finally reopened. This vital artery connecting Detroit and Windsor had become a flashpoint in a much larger and unfolding story. As night falls over the construction site of a massive new project at the US-Canada border, tensions are rising. The Gordie Howe International Bridge, a $5 billion structure meant to strengthen cross-border ties, is now at the center of intense political and economic debate. What was once hailed as a beacon of bilateral cooperation is now clouded by uncertainty. A surprise tariff decision from Washington has cast a long shadow over the project's future. Many are now asking, could these new trade barriers doom the bridge before it's even completed? Beneath the sterile language of policy documents and diplomatic briefings lies a high-stakes struggle, not just about trade or infrastructure, but about national pride and economic survival. And within that struggle, an unexpected twist emerges. One that few saw coming. In this video, we uncover that twist and examine how it could shift the balance of power at the border. But before we dive in, don't forget to hit the like button. Your support helps us beat the YouTube algorithm. Forget the spreadsheets and trade deal fine print. This story is about something far deeper. A leader's ego that nearly caused the United States to lose its greatest advantage and hand it, unintentionally, to Canada. That leader? Donald Trump. While he was loudly championing America First on social media, rallying voters with nationalist slogans, a very different play was unfolding just across the border, in Ottawa. And at the center of it stood Mark Carney. The chief architect of Canada's economic strategy was quietly plotting his moves while Trump made a loud spectacle. Mark Carney stayed calm, thinking several steps ahead. By the time Washington realized the rules had changed, the US was left scrambling to catch up. Before we go any further, make sure to subscribe to the channel. It really motivates us to keep producing this content. Now, let's take a closer look at what the Gordie Howe International Bridge truly represents. This bridge isn't just steel and concrete bolted together. It was once celebrated as a powerful symbol of North American prosperity, praised by Washington as a vital economic lifeline connecting the continent. With nearly $5 billion invested, this span across the Detroit River, linking Michigan and Ontario, was described as the crown jewel of bilateral trade. For Trump's team, it also stood as a living showcase of America First, a legacy project reinforcing the US's claim to regional leadership. It wasn't just infrastructure, it was American strength and credibility made concrete. But all of that came crashing down with a single tweet. On March 2025, Trump abruptly announced a 25% tariff on all cars and auto parts imported from Canada and Mexico. Just 280 characters, but enough to shatter decades of trust. Trump framed the move as a defense of American steel and national security. For Canada, however, it was nothing short of a slap from its closest ally. That tweet changed everything. That tweet amounted to a declaration of economic warfare, signaling the end of frictionless trade and the start of a new era defined by suspicion and conflict. In the hours and days that followed, the shock was unmistakable. The two-way supply chain ground to a halt. Factories from Detroit to Ohio faced critical parts shortages, forcing production cuts. Exports piled up at border crossings, resulting in billions of dollars in losses almost overnight. And the Gordie Howe Bridge, once hailed as a symbol of prosperity, suddenly looked like a costly mistake. It loomed over the Detroit River like a $5 billion question mark. The media quickly seized on the story, turning the bridge into a symbol of failed judgment. Perhaps the clearest evidence yet of an escalating trade war. The blow was unmistakable. The long-standing trust between two close allies now felt like a fragile thread, dangerously close to snapping. Across the river in Windsor, Ontario, anger erupted almost immediately. Auto assemblers, mechanics, and parts suppliers packed union halls, their mood tense and unified as they demanded urgent action. These were people whose livelihoods depended on cross-border trade, now feeling betrayed and targeted. From the podium, UNIFA President Lonna Payne captured the sentiment of thousands of working families. Branding Canada a security threat was nothing less than a direct strike at the heart of the national economy. Her words resonated nationwide. For many Canadians, being labelled a danger by their closest neighbour wasn't just an insult. It was a harsh wake-up call. The era of soft diplomatic language ended overnight. A partner who once stood shoulder to shoulder had suddenly become a rival. Canada understood it needed a swift and decisive response. While the public seethed, Ottawa's back rooms were already in motion. A distinctive, carefully crafted plan began to take shape. The pivotal moment we hinted at earlier, when Mark Carney's strategy stepped into the spotlight. Rather than launch a loud public attack, Carney quietly convened a closed-door meeting with officials and industry leaders to map out a precise countermove. If Washington was treating Canada as an adversary, Canada had no reason to keep playing the friendly neighbour. For the first time in decades, Carney publicly unveiled a bold roadmap to build a united, resilient Canadian economy. Though it might sound like a policy slogan, in Ottawa it was a declaration of economic independence. The message was clear. Canada would no longer take North American integration for granted. In effect, Carney was declaring that the old normal of doing business with the US was over. This was no political theatre. It was a survival strategy, carefully designed to confront head-on the tariff war Trump had ignited. Soon, Carney's team introduced an unprecedented tool, the Reciprocal Framework Regulation, Ottawa's secret weapon. Instead of endless parliamentary debates or slow, piecemeal retaliation, this mechanism enabled an automatic response. Whatever tariffs Washington imposed, Canada would match immediately. No delays, no negotiations. Almost like clockwork, it became an economic shield on autopilot, designed to punish trade aggression in real time. No fiery speeches, no grandstanding, just a cold, calculated algorithm ensuring American exporters felt the sting of Trump's policies instantly. But that was just the beginning. Carney went further, launching a war chest to rebuild Canada's supply chains from the ground up. The government announced a $10 billion emergency fund, branded the Beats Co program, aimed at helping domestic manufacturers weather the crisis. However, there was a catch. Any company accepting aid had to sharply reduce, or entirely eliminate, reliance on US suppliers. In other words, Ottawa was ready to help, but only if firms committed to cutting America out of their supply chain overnight. Countless businesses, long dependent on steel or auto parts from south of the border, scrambled to find alternatives, at home in Europe or in Asia. Decades-old partnerships with US suppliers were severed almost instantly, all in the name of Canada's economic security. And then, the impact began to show. Hardship in American industry was no longer just a looming threat. It became a stark reality. In Detroit, multiple reports revealed small workshops teetering on the brink of collapse. Take Wayne County, Michigan, a traditional hub of foundries and machine shops vital to the US auto industry. Within weeks, more than a dozen family-run foundries faced closure. These were firms that had survived the 2008 financial crisis, and even the pandemic, yet now they were being crushed, not by cheap imports or global competition, but by a political decision made in Washington. They had become the unintended casualties of a war that more and more people believed the United States could not win. Meanwhile, on Canada's west coast, a new front was quietly opening. At the port of Vancouver, American goods suddenly faced a labyrinth of bureaucratic hurdles. Canadian customs authorities introduced a series of origin rules so complex that paying tariffs almost seemed like the easy part. From now on, US companies had to provide detailed declarations for every component in each container shipped north. If they couldn't clearly prove where every piece of metal was smelted or cast, the entire shipment risked being held at the docks. These smelt and cast rules acted like legal traps, forcing American suppliers to expose their entire production chains, virtually handing Ottawa the blueprint of their own industries. While Washington remained bogged down in tariff disputes, Canada was quietly laying the groundwork for the future. Ottawa announced a massive infrastructure project called the Green Hydro Corridor, a transcontinental pipeline network that quickly became the largest infrastructure initiative in Canadian history. Every meter of pipe, every steel beam was produced domestically. Steel plants in Ontario, once near idle, suddenly roared back to life, running day and night at full capacity for the first time in over a decade. The flood of new orders translated into thousands of jobs returning, breathing fresh life into working-class communities. This was more than a stimulus package. It resembled a national reconstruction plan. Canada had undeniably turned the turmoil triggered by Trump into momentum for economic renewal. By mid-2025, even the fisheries sector had become a new battleground. Experts dubbed it the lobster war, with Canada holding a decisive advantage over the US in the global market. Both countries harvest the same species of lobster off the Atlantic coast, but Canada sold far more. The reason wasn't taste or quality, it was negotiation. While Washington withdrew from many trade agreements, Ottawa was busy signing major deals, from CETA with Europe to the CPTPP across the Pacific. These commitments opened new gateways for Canadian products into markets the US had effectively abandoned. The effects were immediate. European importers, long accustomed to sourcing lobsters from Maine, buyers in Europe soon switched to ordering from Nova Scotia. Asian markets followed suit. As a result, US lobster exports plunged by roughly 40%, while Canadian fishers gained vast new markets. In Maine, multi-generational fishing families were thrown into turmoil. One fourth-generation lobsterman lamented that, for the first time in 80 years, his family could no longer sustain itself on their home waters. Figures from 2021 underscored the scale of the shift. Canada sold over $3.2 billion worth of lobsters, while the US failed to reach even $500 million. Same waters, same species, but vastly different outcomes. The lesson was clear. In global trade, relationships and agreements matter as much as the product itself. When one side abandons its seat at the table, the other will seize the opportunity without hesitation. This new reality became dramatically clear on the international stage at the G7 summit in Canmore, Alberta. Tensions between the United States and Canada erupted into a direct confrontation. According to multiple accounts, it was the most heated debate between North American leaders in modern times. Behind closed doors, Donald Trump and Mark Carney clashed fiercely over trade, leaving other heads of state stunned. For the first time since World War II, Canada was no longer standing behind the US. It openly challenged Washington's claim to economic leadership. The alliance forged in the mid-20th century seemed to fracture in that very moment. What once appeared as a policy dispute suddenly escalated into a full-blown crisis of trust between longtime allies, visible for the entire world to see. Soon after, a study by the Serrano Institute in Montreal quantified the long-term consequences if Trump's tariffs remained. Researchers projected US industrial exports could shrink by roughly 1.2% by 2030, compared with about 2.4% for Canada. At first glance, it seemed Canada would bear the heavier blow. But the reality told a different story. Ottawa had moved quickly to diversify markets, strengthening ties with Europe and Asia while reducing dependence on the US. Washington, by contrast, had almost no new gateways left, effectively isolating itself in a spiral of tariffs. Put simply, Canada had prepared an exit strategy. America had not. What seemed like mutual pain ultimately became a trap that ensnared only the United States. This fracture was not confined to economic reports. Ordinary people on both sides of the border felt it in their daily lives. In Detroit, assembly lines that once ran 3 shifts were reduced to a single shift. Auto parts that used to flow seamlessly now sat piled up in warehouses. The once praised just-in-time production system had become the cause of bottlenecks and shutdowns. Across the river in Windsor, even the familiar rhythm of a breakfast diner changed. A long-time waitress confided that about a third of her regulars, mostly auto workers, stopped coming after their shifts were cut. She admitted that only now did it truly hit her. Even selling a simple hamburger could depend on the state of US-Canada relations. It was a clear reminder of how deeply the shocks of this tariff war seeped into daily life. In ways few had imagined. On financial markets, the divide was just as visible. But this time, the advantage leaned toward Canada. The Canadian dollar edged up and held steady, reflecting global investor confidence in Ottawa's economic stewardship, despite the turmoil. Capital poured into Canadian infrastructure bonds and diversification projects, fueling long-term plans. Meanwhile, US markets wavered. Investors grew wary of Washington's erratic trade policy, and many began moving capital to safer ground. Put simply, the financial world was betting that Carney's cautious, calculated strategy would prove steadier in the storm than Trump's tariff gambit. From Bay Street in Toronto to Wall Street in New York, it was becoming increasingly clear who was trusted to steer the economic ship through turbulent waters. On September 17, 2025, the Gordie Howe International Bridge was finally inaugurated to thunderous applause. Officials from both sides of the border gathered to celebrate the $5 billion structure linking Detroit and Windsor. Prime Minister Mark Carney himself cut the ribbon. In his speech, Carney struck a hopeful tone, calling the bridge a symbol of connection between the two nations. One that, in his words, no one could break. Cameras flashed incessantly, and the crowd cheered as the first trucks rolled across the new span. From the outside, it looked like a jubilant ceremony, a rare bright spot amid months of trade turmoil. Yet behind the lights and applause, a less optimistic reality soon emerged. Early projections had estimated roughly 10,200 vehicle crossings per day. But only a few weeks into operation, the actual number stood at about 6,700, nearly one-third lower. With traffic well below expectations, toll revenues dropped sharply. Instead of paying for itself, the massive project now risked becoming a burden on Canadian taxpayers. Ironically, most truckers still preferred the aging Ambassador Bridge, owned by Detroit's Moran family, longtime opponents of the new project. Thanks to lower tolls and deeply entrenched habits, the older bridge continued to carry the bulk of cross-border traffic, while the state-of-the-art Gordie Howe Bridge often stood half-empty. Clearly, Donald Trump's tariff policy had backfired in bitter fashion that he had proclaimed his goal was to bring jobs and production back to the United States. But in practice, he pushed Canada further along the path of economic self-reliance. The irony was striking. The slogan "America First" ended up making America's closest ally more independent than ever. The Gordie Howe Bridge, once envisioned as proof of U.S. trade strength, now looked more like a monument to unintended consequences. A $5 billion symbol, showing that squeezing a friend only pushes that friend to stand more firmly on their own. Since World War II, North America's prosperity had rested on a simple promise. Mutual dependence would bring shared benefit. That promise, fragile yet enduring, lasted through generations, until a single tweet shattered it. Trump's tariff decision not only inflicted economic harm, but also tore apart the trust that had long underpinned the North American alliance. In response, Mark Carney did more than counterpunch. He shifted strategy, calling for a united Canadian economy. Nothing less than a declaration of economic independence. It was a message that Canada would no longer remain wholly dependent on the United States. For the first time in modern history, Canada openly bet it could grow strong and prosperous while charting its own path.